Now with the head back on, I'm going to focus on the timing belt area. So we've got this plastic cover. It's got 4 10mm bolts that secure it in place. Just get all the bolts in loosely first, just so it's lined up, because it can kind of sit in the wrong spot. So make sure all the bolts are in before you start tightening them up. Before we put these pulleys back on, what I want to do is just check this surface here where the seal sits, and you can see that it's kind of a little bit of a groove or a little bit of a mark where the seal has been rubbing. I like just to clean this surface up, because it's not certain that this new seal is going to rub in the exact same spot. So just spend a little bit of time to make sure that this surface here is ready for a new seal. It should be looking something like that. You shouldn't be able to find any deep grooves or anything on it. The next thing is, when we're looking at these two here, you don't want to mix them up. So the one that's got the little lump is on the intake. The one that's got the little hollow is on the exhaust. Now it's also important to not forget these little sort of collars that sit in here, and you can just kind of press them in and they'll just sit in place. Just make sure we do that to both of them. It's very important that they don't get left out. They can sit in either end and they just pop in. I'm also just going to put a drop of oil on here because it's going onto a brand new seal. So I just don't want it to bind up there at all. Now that's the one with the little lump, so that sits on this back one here. I'm just going to sit in position without it tightened up. It's easy to rotate, and you can see at the moment it's not rotating the cam at all. I've just got them roughly in about the position that we're going to lock them down soon. Now you will need 2 new bolts for this section because they are a torque to yield bolt. I'm just going to run these in quickly, but I don't really want them done up tight, not at this point. I want them so that I can still just move these a little bit. Cool. Just want to get these cams in correct position, so I want to use this locking tool so it sits flat in here and lines up to those slots. We'll just rotate that cam just till it's in the right spot and this tool can lock in place. Now with the cams in the correct place, I just want to line up the pulleys. So when you have the tool, there's one that's got a like a notch in it here, and that fits against this part of the pulley. So I'm just going to rotate it up, and I can see here that I've got those lined up. Obviously that's wrong and that's wrong. I'm just hoping from the perspective of the camera that it does actually look lined up. And you can see it there that it is lined up. As I rotate it around, it does look wrong, but trust me, it is correct. And this one we slide into place. just one tooth off, so we'll just put it up like that. Now it might be my locking tool, I've actually got a little bit of movement in it, so I sort of set it into the center point of where that movement is. In this instance, we're wanting to keep the cost down a little bit, so we're reusing the timing belt and tensioner. It was recently replaced, so I'm happy with the condition of it. Just looking here at the tensioner, and I have noticed that there are two different types of tensioners. They're pretty well identical except for one little difference, and that is this hole here. So you've got the ability to pull the tension right back and put a locking pin in there, whereas this one doesn't have that hole, which is quite unusual, and it makes it a little bit harder to install. So most of them that I've seen always have a hole and a little locking pin that you can pull out and set the tension. Strangely, this one doesn't, so I'm not sure what's going on there. Looking at the two of them, they're both made by the same company. They're both made in Canada. One does have a GM stamp on it as well with the hole in it, so maybe that's something to do with that. When your tensioner goes back on, you do need to use a new bolt. Now, just have to line things up, so there is a notch here and there's a little tab that sits down, so you do need to make sure that you get them in the right spot. This little tab sits into this little groove here. It's fairly easy just to get the bolt on a couple of threads, and then you can kind of rotate this and just make sure it's in the right spot. You'll feel when it's in the right spot because it sits solid and it doesn't move around at all. Now, the specs for this bolt are a little unusual. We've got 20 newtons or 15 pound-feet. Then they say an extra 20 degrees. Then they say an extra 15 degrees. I'm not sure why they don't just say an extra 135 degrees, but they're saying doing it in 2 steps, so we'll just follow the instructions given. Now next we're going to go 120 degrees. I'm going to have to eyeball this a little bit because just of the location of it. So I'm thinking if I've got it here and I come up to here, well that's 90, and then I need to go a third of that again. So I feel that's pretty close to the 120. And look, just feeling it, it feels like it's a nice tightness to that bolt. We've got 15 more degrees. I shouldn't be using my torque wrench to do this, my bad. And we've got 15 more degrees, so I'm looking at that as about 45. So it's just a fraction more. And if I was doing that bolt up by hand, that's about the tightness I feel that I would use. I suggest that you do buy a new one. If you're going to reuse a second-hand one, maybe leave it on there and don't take it off. It is possible to remove this head with that still in place, so perhaps that's an easier option for you. I've just removed it to make filming easier. Let's throw that away. Now, if you have a timing belt tensioner kit, you will get one of these little pins. So just looking at this spare pulley I've got here, you can see there's a hex bit or a hex hole in there that we can fit this hex bit into. Then what I can do is I can take the tension up from this. With it zoomed in there, hopefully you can pick it up. Just there's a little hole that's in there. So if I insert this piece of wire into that hole, With this in place, it's just held that tensioner fully back so we can get the timing belt on easily. So I've just come down underneath the wheel arch here, and I now just want to rotate the engine to top dead center. If you remember, we left it a little bit off top dead center just so that there were no potential issues. Now I've also got this extra nut on here. It just made it a little bit easier when I was turning the engine over before. Now I'm just turning this over very carefully and slowly. If you had have left it just a little bit off top dead center, you're really not going to be turning it much anyway. If you have one of these kits, you'll also have sort of a bracket that looks like this. Now this fits down in on the front, this side of the engine. We're going to go underneath, and it can lock the flywheel in place. So upping it underneath the front of the car, we can see we've got the sump here and the bottom of the block here, and there's this bolt that's here. It's a 15mm bolt. Now this will sit in through the bolt hole, and this part comes up and sits into one of the teeth on the flywheel and stops the flywheel from moving. It can be sat just in this little groove in here. It should fit directly in if you've got it lined up on that other pulley. Sometimes you do just need to give it a slight little wiggle if it doesn't fit in. But this fits in. Tighten that bolt up just so it doesn't move out of the way. Now with that lock in place, that's still on top dead center. I'm going to just remove this bolt here. With it locked in place, I can also remove this bolt without the engine rotating. Now you can clearly see that bottom pulley.